Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Jim. I appreciate it.
So let's talk about some of the issues. You've made a considerable stand on the issue of stand your ground right now.
Yeah.
Particularly following the shooting in Clearwater where Marquise McLaughlin was killed.
That's right.
Talk to me about what your position is now.
Well, I tell you, I mean, first of all, my position has been this for some time. I think stand your ground is a dangerous law. It puts power in the hands of an individual, frankly, to snuff out the life of somebody that they may feel threatened by. In the case of Marquise McLaughlin, yes, he physically shoved the shooter, and I don't condone that at all. But I will say there was not an action taken by Marquise McLaughlin on that day that should have resulted in a death sentence. And unfortunately, stand your ground allows for vigilantes to take the power to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner all at once.
So you believe that man was a vigilante at that point?
I absolutely do believe that, and partly because we enable it. I think stand your ground law, which took Castle Doctrine, which in my belief is sound doctrine, which basically says that if someone intrudes upon your house, your property, that you have the ability and the right to defend yourself and your family. And what that did is it took it into the public square, and then through this very subjective formula. Basically, if you feel threatened, you have the ability and the right to defend yourself with life-taking measure. In my opinion, that's unreasonable law and has no place in civil society.
So, as I understand your position, and clarify it for me, if you're elected governor, you will suspend that law?
Yeah, I mean, what we
do you have the legal authority to do that?
Yeah, well, let me be clear. What we have asked is for Governor Rick Scott to use his executive order and declaring emergencies, which allows him to suspend any law for 60 days. And it can only then be continuously extended by him every 60 days. And what we're saying, and by the way, I use the language that the NRA used. They basically said that they believe that the sheriff in this case erred, that he actually had the power to make an arrest, and that they believe he's misinterpreting the law. Well, when you create this kind of confusion, when this kind of uncertainty exists, and at the end of the day, an individual is allowed to apply this law in their own understanding and snuff out the life of an otherwise innocent person, to me, that is an emergency, especially when you consider that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by the application of this law.
But this could set a very dangerous precedent. You have a legislature duly elected by the people that, whether you like this law or not, passed this law.
Absolutely.
And should you really, as the governor, have the ability to stymie the will of the people, in essence, through their legislative body, to enact laws? Doesn't that set you up as a king?
Well, let me be very clear. I do believe that ultimately the legislature needs to resolve this issue. I absolutely believe that this is in the legislative domain. However, the legislature is not in session, and they're only in session 3 months out of the year. And in the interim period of time, you have people's lives that are being put at risk and are at stake. Now, we got a governor who literally reached into a separate branch of government in the case of Aramis Ayala and took her caseloads that in any way impacted death penalty and reassigned them. Now, if you want to talk about overreach of the office of the governor, now that would be a clear example. In my case, I'm saying I do believe that the legislature plays a role, and I do believe that the legislature ought to, in their power, repeal this law. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that we keep people protected under the law here in the state of Florida.
You brought up the death penalty. It was actually the next thing on my list, which was, do you believe the death penalty is applied fairly in Florida?
I don't believe it's applied fairly,
So let's start there. So if you don't believe it's applied fairly, one of your duties as governor will be to sign death warrants. Absolutely. Will you refuse to sign death warrants?
I would not. Let me tell you what I believe. I believe that we ought to have an in-depth analysis on why it is that in cases where the defendant is a person of color, that it appears, based off the facts and off the evidence, that people of color, even in cases of similar crimes being committed between a white defendant and a black defendants are more likely to receive the death penalty. So
while this analysis is going on, would you suspend the use of the death penalty?
We absolutely should, and that's what we've talked about for the period of time until we can come up with some answers as to why it is that there seems to be in this state a racial bias when it comes to the application of the death penalty.
And how long do you think that might take?
Well, we've got brilliant minds and we've got brilliant partners and organizations all around the state that can aid us in getting to the bottom of this. There was a very good, strong report done by the Sarasota Herald Tribune about a year and a half ago that talked about the bias on the bench. And what it showed is that in cases where the defendants or the perpetrators were, the fact pattern was practically the same in every instance, the only difference being the color of the skin of the defendant, that the defendants of darker complexion, of darker skin, black and brown defendants got harsher penalties.
I just want to be clear. If you're elected governor, you will suspend the use of the death penalty until you are assured that there is no bias in the system.
That's exactly what we would be looking for.
Essentially, you could end up eliminating the death penalty by refusing to use it.
Well, the governor, obviously, it is a power that exists in this state. And obviously, I am not a death penalty opponent. I was pleased to get the endorsement of Aramis Ayala, but that was one of the areas in which we had slight difference. But where we agree is that we both know, as do a lot of researchers in this state and those nationally who have observed the application of the death penalty in this state, we know that there is bias in the system. We need to figure that out.
What about the pain that it could cause families of victims who are waiting to have the ultimate sentence handed down in the case involving their loved one, and you come along and suspend the use of the death penalty? What are you going to tell those families who are seeking justice?
Well, first of all, justice delayed is not justice denied. Justice will be had here, but you got to ensure that when it comes to taking the life of another living, breathing human being, that we've got to be absolutely certain that we don't have bias in the system when it comes to that. Right. I'm talking about the instances, that's just where you have individuals who have committed the very same crimes, very same fact pattern, yet a defendant who is white receives a lesser sentence and a lesser penalty than people of color. We've got to get to that. Under what situation and circumstances is that right?
But you would suspend the use of death penalty in all cases, not just against people of color.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And what we're saying is that we need to understand better. To the extent that bias exists in the system, we have to get that out. We've got to understand much better how it is in this state we can ensure that justice is indeed blind and colorblind in this case.
Why are you a better candidate to take on the Republicans this year than your other Democrats who are running, especially if the nominee looks to be Ron DeSantis, the congressman? Why are you better suited to do that?
I appreciate the question. First of all, and this has been our case all along, Democrats have lost the last two races for governor by less than a point. Less than 70,000 votes have separated us between winning and losing. Many of the votes who we need in these midterm elections are part of the electorate that rarely shows out and turns out in midterms. They're blacker voters, they're brown voters, they're younger voters, they're poorer voters. If we're going to win, we have absolutely got to increase the turnout amongst those constituencies. I trust my ability to reach those voters better than anybody else in this race. I trust my ability to do that not only because of the strength of our message, but as the only non-millionaire competing in this race, my lived experience in this state is more like the everyday average voter who we're trying to reach more than anybody else running. And I believe that many of those voters who are oftentimes struggling between which bills to pay, making sure they got food on the table, making sure that their kids are living in safe environments and are able to matriculate through an education system that supports their learning, they're looking for a voice that reflects their lived experience. I believe that I reflect it better than anybody else in this race. And if we're going to turn those voters out, we've got to do it with the strongest possible advocate on those issues as we possibly can. And I believe that those voters who we very much so need to turn out, are going to conclude that I'm the best representative, the best candidate to be able to do that of the crop of us that are running. I've made the comment that it is not my job to destroy sugar. They are an important agricultural part of this state. It's my job to make them better stewards of our state. I want the southern flow and the reestablishment of the southern flow of water from Lake Okeechobee down to the Everglades. That is right now being cut off and disrupted by sugar. As governor, I look forward to negotiating with them to reestablish the southern flow of water from the Lake Okeechobee into the Everglades. I also look forward to to working with the people in the Glades who are many times a part of this conversation, are the subject of this conversation, but never, ever, ever are at the table when it comes to what does the future economic development for their community looks like as we work to interrupt and make sugar a more responsible partner and player. When I was in the Glades, I talked to them about what does it mean to work on retraining, on apprenticeships, on the kinds of, I think, job development and skill development that will be necessary to, I think, make that workforce ready for the future of work in the state of Florida. I think that you can have a conversation about sugar and about the sugar industry, but without saying that we want to destroy them. I don't want to destroy them. I want to make them a better corporate citizen here in the state of Florida. And as governor, what they can expect from me is that I will be even-handed. They can expect from me that I will be a constant friend of the environment because it is not theirs to destroy, it is all of ours, which means they've got to be better stewards.